Welcome, everyone. We're excited that you're able to join us on this webinar, Advancing Transportation Decarbonization Through Rigorous Evaluation in the Climate Action Learning Lab. Just a heads up that this webinar will be recorded and we'll be taking a few screenshots throughout. Please ask any questions through the Q&A feature at the bottom of your Zoom screen, and we'll either respond to these directly in the chat or during the Q&A portion at the end of the webinar. And my name is Maggie Dennis. I'm a Senior Policy Associate at JPAL North America. Today, we will hear from Aaron Graber, the Environment, Energy, and Climate Change Sector Lead at JPAL North America, as well as Krute Singa, a Principal Planner at the Metropolitan Transportation Commission and Association of Bay Area Governments, and Dr. Casey Wichman, an Associate Professor of Economics at the Georgia Institute of Technology. Then here's just a brief outline of how we'll use the time together today. We'll start with an overview of JPAL North America, the Climate Action Learning Lab, and the role of randomized evaluation in transportation decarbonization. We'll then hear presentations from Krute and Casey on their experiences conducting randomized evaluations in the transportation space as part of researcher-practitioner partnerships, and have a brief panel discussion to hear their insights on what makes a successful research partnership. We'll close with additional information on the Climate Action Learning Lab application, an audience Q&A, and a short feedback survey. So I'll turn it over to Aaron Graber to provide an introduction to randomized evaluation and the Climate Action Learning Lab at JPAL.
Great. Thanks so much, Maggie, and hello, everyone. Great to be here today. I'm excited to share a little bit more about JPAL and our work in the transportation decarbonization space. So for those of you who are a little less familiar with JPAL, JPAL stands for the Abdul Latif Jameel Poverty Action Lab, which was founded in 2003. And we're a research center that's based in the Department of Economics at MIT. And Maggie and I work in the North America Regional Office, which is about 12 years old, and it specifically focuses on research and policy in North America. JPAL's mission is to reduce poverty by ensuring that policy is informed by scientific evidence. And so we do that through kind of three core functions. The first is research. So we fund and run research in partnership with a large network of academic researchers with a specific expertise in randomized evaluation. And I'll speak a little bit more about this methodology in a minute. The second core function is policy outreach. So we aim to ensure that research is translated into policy and practice, and that the results of our evaluations end up in the hands of those who can really use that information. So particularly policymakers and decision makers. And we also work to make sure that effective policies and programs are scaled up. Our third core function is capacity building. So we lead evaluation trainings and programs like the Climate Action Learning Lab, which we'll be discussing in a minute, to really build capacity of government leaders and nonprofit leaders to really generate and use evidence, and to kind of help think about how we can do evaluations in practice. So these are kind of the three core functions that we see that really connect the dots from research to action. So at JPAL North America, we see decarbonization as a really key policy priority. And I think as many of you on the call are already aware, transportation is the fastest growing contributor to global greenhouse gas emissions. And passenger transit makes up around 80% of transportation sector emissions here in the US. As many of you also likely know, transportation is linked to economic mobility and environmental justice issues. So we know that low-income communities and communities of color are more likely to experience negative health effects, such as, as kind of a result of transportation emissions. And they're also more likely to experience transportation insecurity. And while we recognize that kind of long-term, right, transportation decarbonization really requires systemic changes to grid composition and infrastructure, but particularly in the short term, we see a real need to understand the behavioral mechanisms that really drive passenger transportation decarbonization. And in the current political climate, with limited federal commitment to climate programming and investment, really, we just see that state and local leaders are really on the forefront of climate action. And we're really excited to be supporting these leaders in your efforts and to really be working together to test and learn which strategies are most effective in the battle against climate change. Okay, so I wanted to just briefly discuss some of kind of the key reasons why we're focusing on randomized evaluation specifically within decarbonization programming. And so this is, related to transportation as well as to other sectors. So first, rigorous evidence on what works to reduce emissions is really limited, right? A lot of the decisions that are made are often based on engineering projections, and those often have built-in assumptions about behavior change that have not yet been rigorously tested. And second, behavior change is really critical to emissions reductions. So state and local governments are experimenting with a lot of different types of interventions that involve a range of incentives, different designs, different recruitment strategies. And a lot of these programs really rely on behavior change. So as an example, providing rebates to encourage individuals to purchase an electric vehicle. But there's still so much that's unknown about how to really structure and specifically how to target these decarbonization programs so that they bring about the intended behavior change that we're looking for. And then lastly, as these new programs roll out, we see a real opportunity here to proactively embed randomized evaluations into those programs so that we can more accurately measure their impacts once they've been completed. So just to provide a little bit of background context, I'm going to give a very brief primer. I think we have presentations that are much more extensive on exactly what randomized evaluation is, but just to kind of situate where and when randomized evaluation can really be used to promote evidence-based decision-making. So across a broader project lifecycle, there are a number of different questions that evidence can help us answer, right? So when identifying and diagnosing the problem, when adapting or designing a program, when implementing and evaluating a program's impact, or when we're deciding whether to scale a program. So when we're looking specifically at randomized evaluation or other impact evaluation methodologies, these are most applicable in that third category, which is focused on implementation and evaluation. And I can dig kind of quickly a bit more into the methodology here. So randomized evaluations help us to understand what would have happened if a program had not taken place by comparing the outcomes of a group that receives a program, whether that's individuals or communities, against a group that has not received that program. So we start with a pool of people or buildings, communities, who kind of meet the eligibility criteria for a program. And then from that pool, we randomly assign people to two groups. And when I say random, I mean random, like think lottery. And with that type of randomization, we can be confident that these groups do not systematically differ at the beginning of the study. And this doesn't mean necessarily that they're identical, right? It's not like everyone in one group has a twin in the other group. There's still variation across people, but there's no pattern here. So everyone has the same probability of being in each group. And with a large enough sample, we should expect that there's no major differences between those groups. So what we'll say is that we can compare these two groups like apples to apples. In contrast, if people are sorted into groups through non-randomized means, such as comparing those who opt into a program to those who opt out, as one example, or those who are mandated to a program to compare those to those who are not, there's really just a high chance that there are important differences between these two groups that could actually impact our results. So as one example, if we offer a program on a first come and first served basis, I think, we can understand that the people who sign up first might have really important differences to the ones who did not. And those differences might really impact the outcomes of interest. So these scenarios we think of as basically comparing apples to oranges. So when you randomly assign groups, the only difference is the one that you introduce. So this is your program or your intervention. And then you can really look at your outcomes. And because the groups were the same at the onset, you can conclude that any differences that you see in outcomes is due to the program itself. And this is why randomized evaluations are really uniquely positioned to help us understand the impact of a program and why they can just be so valuable for informing evidence-based policies. So there are existing studies and research already out there on the effectiveness of transportation decarbonization strategies. And when JPAL began to focus on transportation decarbonization a few years ago, we conducted a systematic literature review of the findings from randomized evaluations and other rigorous evaluations on ground transportation decarbonization efforts in North America. And we again could have an entire webinar that focuses specifically on the results of that white paper. Unfortunately, we won't have time to kind of dig into that level of detail today. But this white paper helped us to really identify some existing research insights on topics such as EV adoption strategies, public transportation ridership, and tolls and congestion pricing. But what we also found is that there were a large number of key gaps where academic research and local priorities by policymakers and practitioners at the state and local level were just really not aligned, and that we found there were a lot of additional areas where policy relevant research was needed. So some of those priority areas for additional researcher practitioner collaborations could look at areas like fleet shift, public transit, traffic congestion. And this slide kind of highlights some of what those potential research questions in these areas could look like. So questions like which policy levers could really increase EV charging most effectively, or do e-bike libraries increase public transportation use? And how do app-based behavioral incentives impact congestion patterns? So we'll also be providing a link to the literature review at the end of this presentation for those who are interested in learning more. And we're also in the process of developing a policy summary of this resource that will be available in the next couple of months. So that kind of leads us to today and the launch of the JPAL North America Climate Action Learning Lab. So through many conversations with local decision makers and partners, we have really understood that there can be a lot of barriers to implementing an impact evaluation, specifically a randomized evaluation, right? Regardless of their value. We've heard that these types of evaluations can just be really challenging to prioritize. They often require team capacity building. They require more support in identifying testable, policy-relevant research questions. And it can also be really difficult to kind of find the right partnerships with researchers and others to really support evaluation design and implementation. So the Climate Action Learning Lab is a new program that we're introducing that really aims to address a lot of these key barriers that we heard from practitioners. And the lab focused on supporting climate leaders in three key areas. So the first is to build skills and knowledge in evidence generation and use. The second is to review and apply research insights to local contexts and programs. And the third is to help identify priority research questions that can guide evidence building and decision-making practices. So how do we plan to do that? So from May to July of this year, Learning Lab participants will be participating in a suite of offerings that we anticipate will require about 1 to 2 hours of time per week. And participants are going to be engaging in 4 different types of programming. So first, Learning Lab participants will join a series of virtual training sessions on topics like key evaluation concepts, things like why and how to randomize, theory of change frameworks, as well as different evaluation designs. We'll also be looking into learning agenda frameworks that can help explore how to scope programs for rigorous evaluation opportunities. And we'll also dig into evidence reviews of common mitigation programming and related policy insights, drawing from resources like the Transportation Decarbonization white paper that I had mentioned. And And we'll also conduct periodic learning sessions with peers, with some of the other climate leaders in the Learning Lab cohort, so that these participants can really share questions, insights, and experiences around the design and use of impact evaluations. And to support participants in really applying insights from these trainings and from the peer learning sessions, JPAL staff will provide customized one-on-one strategy sessions with each of the participating jurisdictions and organizations. And then finally, we will be sponsoring 2 participants per participating organization and jurisdiction to attend an in-person summit here in Cambridge, Massachusetts in July. And during the summit, we're excited to be bringing together the Learning Lab participants with their cohort members, with researchers in the JPAL network, and with other climate leaders to discuss this work together in person. And in terms of kind of what people will take away from this experience, at the end of the Learning Lab, our goal is to have each jurisdiction or organization complete an evidence and evaluation playbook, which will be completed throughout the Learning Lab offerings. So this will include documentation on some of the relevant insights from the existing climate evidence base, a set of prioritized research questions to guide the design and implementation of decarbonization programming, along with a strategic evaluation plan for a priority research question. Teams that are interested can also receive public recognition as champions for evidence use in climate action. And select jurisdictions will also be matched with researchers from the JPAL network to support the design of a randomized evaluation of a policy or program. And these teams will have the opportunity to apply for up to $400,000 in JPAL funding to help actually implement those randomized evaluations. And then finally, JPAL will continue to offer virtual peer learning engagements, including periodic facilitated meetings and a moderated online platform. And in cultivating this community, we're really hoping that we can build the evidence base on promising approaches that can help us as a community scale the solutions that work. So just lastly, before I turn it over to Krute and to Casey, I just wanted to talk a little bit about who should apply. So we're really targeting the local decision makers who are committed to advancing effective solutions to climate mitigation. And in particular, we're looking for jurisdictions and organizations that might be launching a climate action plan or a broader series of programs, particularly those that are launching within the coming 6 months to 2 years. As well as grant recipients who may have recently received funding from a climate mitigation program. I think finally, we're also really interested in engaging with jurisdictions and organizations that may be planning to apply for grant funding for climate mitigation strategies. And they're interested in looking into how to build an evaluation into their proposal in order to strengthen it. Great. So what does a randomized evaluation really look like in practice, right? So I'm just thrilled today to have Krute and Casey here who can really provide a couple of concrete examples of impact evaluations in this space and how they are hoping to inform key policy questions and ultimately improve programming and lives. So from here, I'd love to hand it over to Krute.
Great. Hi, everyone. Again, I'm Krute. I'm with the Metropolitan Transportation Commission and the Association of Bay Area Governments. Next slide, please. As Erin mentioned, I'm going to be sharing the findings of the Incentivizing Active and Shared Transportation Pilot Project, and also talk about why we decided to conduct this pilot program, as well as why we used a randomized controlled trial approach. Next slide, please. But before getting into the pilot, I just want to provide some background. We're an agency that has 2 main roles. The Metropolitan Transportation Commission is the San Francisco Bay Area's metropolitan planning organization and a transportation planning, financing, and coordinating agency. And the Association of Bay Area Governments strengthens coordination between the 100+ cities in the region. Next slide, please. So one of our main requirements is to develop a 30-year regional transportation plan and sustainable community strategy to meet California's climate targets. The plan, which is called Plan Bay Area 2050, includes a behavior change strategy, which is part of the Transportation Demand Management Program, with the primary goal of reducing solo driving trips to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And because this behavior change strategy was included in the plan, which goes through an extensive approval process internally with our stakeholders and with the public, there is support to conduct a pilot. Next slide, please. And then the next slide. Thanks. All right, so the reason we started off with a pilot is to understand how to move away from a top-down approach to travel campaigns to reducing solo driving to one that is more targeted and more effective in changing behavior. So we decided to use a behavioral economics or science approach, which is not new, especially in the health sector, but it's not very common in transportation. Instead, we've traditionally approached travel campaigns by appealing to rational decision-making. Behavioral economics and science kind of diverges from this by acknowledging the psychological and social factors that impact decision-making and often leading to choices that are not rational. And then on top of this, you have to add in the transportation landscape conditions, life responsibilities, and other constraints influencing the mobility option decision. So this approach really allows us to understand people's decision-making process and then tailor or personalize the messaging that addresses their barriers. Next slide, please. So with this approach in mind, I wrote into a request for proposals the objectives of the pilot, which were to understand behavior and the trade-offs people face when deciding between driving alone and using an active or shared travel option, which includes walking, biking, and taking transit. Another goal was to determine what types of messaging can compel solo drivers to shift to an active or shared mode. And lastly, to determine how to scale a behavior change program and make behavior change long-lasting after the messaging and incentive period ends. We also targeted any type of habitual trip. So this meant shopping, medical appointments, and the gym, in addition to work trips. And as I mentioned previously, the overarching goal was to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Next slide, please. So through the request for proposals, we contracted with a team primed by Metropia. So Metropia takes a mobility as a service approach for congestion mitigation, and they designed the pilot and the evaluation framework. They delivered the messaging and incentives through their app and tracked and learned from the behavior to iterate on program design for the pilot. One of their sub-consultants, the behavioralist, is co-founded by Rob Metcalf, who is a researcher associated with JPAL. And it's a data science firm which used a blend of behavioral science and academic evaluation to help design and evaluate the pilot. Next slide, please. So with the consultant team, we identified the approach and research questions with the key question being who are the individuals whose behavior and habits are open to change. So this approach really acknowledges that not everyone has habits or behavior that are open to change, or in behavior science terms are nudgeable. So this again is a departure of how transportation campaigns are usually developed. Next slide, please. So the initial approach we were going to use had to be modified because of the pandemic. The pandemic delayed the start of the pilot. It impacted how frequently people were traveling and the modes they were likely to select, which then affected both the participant recruitment and the messaging available. And it ultimately increased the cost per participant due to increased marketing costs. However, we did have one advantage. Our residents' routines were disrupted, which is an ideal time to prompt new behavior. So we ended up designing the pilot similar to a focus group. And we were going to have a control and treatment group with the initial design of the pilot and continued to kind of use this approach when we had to pivot. So using the control and treatment approach helped us to understand what levels of incentives and what types of messaging compelled behavior change in our target audience. And we also recruited our target audience through Facebook and Instagram ads. Next slide, please. Now, because we wanted to understand what messages and incentive levels compelled behavior change, we ran 2 experiments using Metropia's app. Next slide, please. So just to get into a little bit of detail, we once recruited, the participant could use the Metropia app to plan a trip. When they did that, they entered into what we called experiment 1, and their trip was either entered into a control group and received no messaging, or the treatment group and it received one of 4 different types of messaging. If the app recorded the participant making 3 trips to the same origin and destination by car, we decided this was a habitual trip, and the participant moved to experiment 2. Again, we had a control group and a treatment group that received messaging and incentives, and the consultant team used the results between the control and treatment groups to iterate on messaging and incentive levels as the pilot was going on. And now with the results of both experiments, we're developing the recommendations for scaling the pilot program. Next slide, please. So here are the messages we use for experiment 1. Again, the control group received no messages, and the treatment group got messages focused on the social cost of driving, or a reminder of their previously stated concern about climate change that was collected during the participant recruitment survey. Here, the purpose of the control and treatment groups was to determine the effect of messaging only on changing behavior. Next slide, please. Now, as I mentioned, experiment 2 tested both messaging and incentive levels. So we tested a few approaches, like sending a suggestion to use a mode that was randomly picked, or a suggestion to use a mode that was based on origin and destination and was time competitive and straightforward to use. So the point of experiment 2's control and treatment group were to see what messages, incentive levels, and personalization could compel a participant to use an active or shared mode instead of driving alone for their habitual trip, which are typically the hardest to shift, as they're kind of automatic for the person. Next slide, please. And one more, sorry. Overall, we got promising results from the pilot. Due to COVID, the pilot lasted for 9 months, mainly because it was hard to recruit participants who were traveling regularly during the pandemic. But we were able to get a statistically significant sample size. We were also successful in recruiting over 200 solo drivers who ended up taking nearly 30,000 trips. And we did this on a very tight budget. Next slide, please. So we found that offering a 3 to 5 incentive level or dollar incentive decreased driving over just messaging alone. However, we did find that we could offer a lower incentive amount when suggesting an option that was time competitive and straightforward between the participant's origin and destination compared to random suggestions. So in other words, when we personalized the suggestion. A walking suggestion paired with an incentive had a 22% higher behavior change rate than the control group, which received no message and no incentive. And cycling had a 65% higher behavior change rate than the control group. We also learned that if viable transit options were available between the trip origin and destination, the likelihood of using transit was 3 times higher than the control group. And here, for this pilot, the viable transit means that the walk to the transit stop is less than 15 minutes, and then the in-vehicle time is up to 20 minutes. So just to kind of summarize this, the personalization is key to changing behavior, and it's not surprising, as the recent trend in all sectors is that consumers are demanding personalized experiences from companies vying for their attention. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned, we're still determining the best way to scale up the pilot and what to focus on, but overall, we would like to use this behavioral science, randomized control trial, and targeted marketing approach for our outreach and travel campaigns. I'll also note that all the reports on the pilot is found on our website, and I will put the link into the chat in a second. And that's it for me. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Krute, for that great presentation. Really interesting insights on how randomized evaluation has been used at MTC. So we'll now hear from Casey Wichman on his work with the Atlanta Regional Commission.
Hello, everyone. I'm excited to be here. My name is Casey Wichman. I'm an associate professor of economics at Georgia Tech. And I am sort of a weird economist who likes writing papers about bicycles. And so I'm going to talk about a very early stage partnership with the Atlanta Regional Commission, which is a planning agency that covers multiple cities and counties in the Atlanta metro region, to focus on an e-bike rebate program that they initiated last year in 2024. Next slide, please. Okay, so the project team, and I'll talk a little bit about the formation of this partnership, is myself, as well as two folks in the public policy school here at Georgia Tech, Derek McNutt, who is a PhD student, as well as my colleague Tony Harding, who's an assistant professor in public policy. And our partners at Atlanta Regional Council that we've been working with and who have been instrumental for kind of getting the Atlanta e-bike rebate program off the ground have been Ben Camber and Bennett Foster. And as a disclaimer, I am talking completely from my own perspective, and so please don't interpret anything that I say as reflective of the views of the Atlanta Regional Council, or ARC. Next slide, please. Okay, so just a little bit of background on Atlanta's e-bike rebate program, and then I'll talk a little bit about what it is that we're trying to do to understand this program and evaluate the effectiveness of this program further on. And so this is a partnership between the Atlanta Regional Commission, the City of Atlanta, and Propel ATL. And it is an equity-focused rebate program that's intended to provide reliable, affordable, and sustainable transportation options for Atlanta residents, as well as to reduce transportation costs. This started with $1 million investment from the City of Atlanta, most of which went towards actual rebates for individuals to purchase e-bicycles. And when I say e-bicycles, I mean, bikes that have a motor that is either an e-assist and can kind of help you move along, help you climb up hills a little bit easier. As an aside, I was a pretty big cyclist for most of my life, but then a few years ago, I purchased my own e-bike, and I can't tell you how much of a game changer it was for actually committing to being kind of a full e-bike commuter. And so I schlepped my son around, who is almost 5, ride him to school. And Atlanta does have hills, and it gets hot in the summer. And the e-bike really was kind of a game changer in terms of transforming my personal commuting patterns. And so my interest in this program is really kind of to try to see how effective getting more people on e-bikes can be to reduce the amount of vehicle miles traveled, or miles traveled in personal vehicles that contribute to local air pollution, greenhouse gas emissions, and things like that. So a little bit more on the program. This was an equity-focused program, so 75% of the rebate funds were earmarked for income-qualified participants, and those participants needed to be at 80% of the area median income. So a lot of the funding was kind of targeted. There were different rebate amounts for different types of bikes, ranging from $500 to $2,000 rebates for whether you got a regular e-bike or an e-cargo bike, which is what I ride to kind of have my son on the back. And the dollar value was differentiated by whether you were income qualified or not. And so if you were an income qualified member who purchased an e-cargo bike, that would get you a $2,000 rebate. This is a substantial amount relative to the total cost of an e-bike. And so I would expect this kind of level of funding to have a pretty big impact on the likelihood that people purchase an e-bike. The program was restricted to City of Atlanta residents. So there was a kind of you had to submit an address, and it was verified that you do live in the city of Atlanta, and you needed to purchase an e-bike from a local bike shop that was also within the city of Atlanta. So very much intended to keep this investment within the city. And so one of the interesting things, and I'll talk about the partnership in more detail, but this was not an intentional randomized evaluation that Aaron was mentioning and that Krute was describing as well. This was kind of an incidental experiment because ARC, when deciding how to structure their program, they were looking at other programs throughout the country, some of which had e-bike rebates that were first come, first serve. And they wanted to make sure that everyone who applied within a certain time window had an equal likelihood of receiving the e-bike, adjusted for, there was a little bit more weight placed on the income qualified applicants. And so I mentioned this and kind of emphasize this because the main reason they decided to kind of conduct their rebate program as a lottery was to ensure fairness across participants. And in other partnerships I've had with local governments, sometimes they kind of shy away from randomization because it doesn't necessarily seem to them like a way to equitably allocate resources. But I was really excited to see that ARC kind of did this on their own, not for an evaluation purpose, but to ensure fairness across applicants. Next slide, please. So just to give you a little bit of early insights into the effectiveness of this e-bike rebate program, which was conducted in 2 waves in 2024, one in kind of the late spring, early summer, and one in the fall of 2024. So it's still relatively early on. They had over 11,000 unique applications. And they issued 919 rebates, 734 of those were redeemed. So it was conducted as a lottery, and it was a pretty difficult lottery to win. If you kind of convert those to percentages, that's a pretty low rebate percentage just because of the overall demand for the rebate program. 45% of applicants indicated that they wanted to be considered for the income qualified purchase. 97% of the funds that have been allocated have been spent at local bike shops. And 82% of the rebate funds went to income qualified applicants. So that equity focused component of the program seems to have delivered on that so far. They've conducted a survey. ARC is in the process of conducting several surveys for participants that have some self-reported utilization rates of their e-bike, what kind of e-bike they purchased, how many car trips they're taking per month, and they can compare them to baseline survey information. And so it seems like the program is essentially doing what it's intended to do. Recipients are reporting 40% fewer car trips per month. 75%, about 75% of recipients are riding their e-bike more than twice a week. And along kind of demographics we might care about, there's kind of good representation. 54% of applicants were male, so there was pretty good gender breakdown. And less than 50% of recipients are white. Atlanta is a predominantly Black city, and so this is kind of reflective of the population of Atlanta. Next slide, please. So just to give you a little bit of background as to, those are kind of summary statistics of the program so far. But once the program was announced publicly in January of 2024, we learned that almost at least 4 that I know of, researchers or research teams at Georgia Tech alone had reached out to ARC to inquire about a research partnership, getting access to data, potentially developing joint research together, which I think emphasizes just the latent demand of researchers wanting to partner with local government organizations who are implementing new programs. And so the partnership that kind of fell out of a few conversations was a consolidation of a few research groups that we join forces to streamline partnership. And one of my collaborators, Derek, is kind of working with ARC on other questions as well, and that will be part of his dissertation. But just want to emphasize the kind of demand for these types of partnerships from the academic side. So what we've done is kind of atypical of a lot of, I think, what JPAL's partnerships look like, because the researchers kind of came in on the back end. But what we were able to do was jointly develop a baseline survey at the time of application. So we were collecting a little bit of information on demographics, mode choice questions, how much they bike, whether they already own a bike, at the time of application, which is important because that's giving us a good baseline set of information about applicants. And then ARC planned incentivized follow-up surveys for participants. But as I mentioned, this program was randomized. And so where we came in as kind of academic partners was we're in the process of developing a follow-up survey for the non-participants, the people who applied for the e-bike rebate, but did not get it. They were kind of randomized incidentally into a control group. And we're kind of funding this with resources in-house that come from Epicenter, this Energy Policy Innovation Center at Georgia Tech. Next slide, please. So the ongoing research and survey design is very much kind of in process. We're working through a lot of technical details at the moment, but there were about a little over 11,000 customers who applied to partake in the rebate program. We'll get about 9,000 of those will be our sample frame, where we're going to send out a survey to get baseline, or to get demographics, income, commuting behavior information. ARC is already conducting participant surveys in a few waves. They're getting very high response rates from people who did receive the rebate. And they're getting information on e-bike purchase and utilization. And then, as I mentioned, we're developing this non-participant survey, which mirrors the questions that are on the participant survey that ARC is sending out. We're incentivizing this with a lottery. You can win a $100 gift card if you participate. And this is really the ideal comparison population, because these are individuals who, if they would have won the e-bike rebate, they would have likely purchased it. It kind of comes from the same comparison population that you would want. And so right now we're just finalizing the survey, going through IRB, developing data sharing agreements, and understanding workflow to hand off data between Georgia Tech and the partners. Next slide, please. Okay, so as I was mentioning, ARC is already conducting a little bit of analysis on their program so far. And so they have a baseline applicant survey that has basic demographics and transportation information about each of the rebate participants. These are people who have received the rebates, have purchased an e-bike. And so in a follow-up survey that they have conducted some, and they're still conducting some more, they know that the applicant has purchased an e-bike. They know details about the e-bike, what make, what model, how much it was purchased for, what bike shop it was purchased for, and then some information about their transportation behavior. Are they driving less? Are they taking the bus less? What are the trade-offs individuals are making? Next slide, please. And what we're trying to do in our non-participant survey is we have the same baseline information from the applicants, but we know people did not receive the rebate because they were kind of randomized not to receive the rebate, but we want to send them a very similar follow-up survey to ask a few questions. We want to know, even in the absence of the rebate, did they also purchase an e-bike? This will help us understand how much of the rebate was influential for actually getting people to purchase this new technology. How much did they buy a cheaper e-bike? Would they have purchased a more expensive e-bike if they had gotten the rebate? Did they actually drive less? And I want to emphasize, and if you could click to the next slide, please. I want to emphasize that you could make the comparison only along the top arrow, the green line, by looking at people who received the e-bike rebate and compare their outcomes relative to what they reported at the baseline survey in the applicant survey. But the comparison you really want to make is for people who would have purchased an e-bike if they got the rebate, what did they do in the absence of that treatment? What did they do in the absence of getting a rebate? That's going to tell you a little bit more about the program effectiveness, whether people are, whether the rebate is additional, whether it's getting more people to purchase e-bikes they wouldn't otherwise purchase. And I want to emphasize my partner, she applied for the e-bike rebate and did not get it. And then once she realized she didn't get it, she purchased an e-bike on her own. And so from a program design perspective, you really don't want to subsidize someone who's going to be purchasing an e-bike on their own. And so we're going to be able to get a little bit more information about how we can increase the effectiveness of any dollars spent in subsidizing e-bikes. Next slide, please. Okay, so we're asking a few kind of basic questions that I think are really interesting in this space, because there's not a lot of work on how to incentivize people to commit to purchasing new transportation technology. And then in particular, I think there's a big gap on how do you get people to actually use that technology? How do you get people to ride their e-bike once they've purchased it? So we're looking at program additionality and effectiveness. As I mentioned, did non-participants purchase an e-bike anyway? Did participants purchase a more expensive e-bike than they otherwise would have? And then how much, what are the distributional implications? How much did producers and consumers capture of that rebate? We also want to look at factors that influence the decision to adopt: race, income, commuting, safety, whether they already own a bike, and then the extent to which now having an e-bike changes their behavior after. How much do they ride it? Do they reduce vehicle miles traveled? Do they reduce bus trips? Do they increase rail trips? We'll be able to get a little bit at that question. Next slide, please. Okay, and this is my last slide. We're kind of carrying out this survey at the moment. There are some discussions for potentially renewing this e-bike program and expanding it. And so we hope that our research will be informative for the design of that program, and maybe we'll be able to have more input in the design based on the results of our study. And then I think there's also kind of a wish list for future research where if you were able to randomize the rebate amount, that might allow you to optimize the program a little bit better. Perhaps the rebate was too generous. Maybe people don't need so much money. They just need a little bit of a rebate to get them out to the bike shop to actually purchase the bike. And then, a pie in the sky idea that I'm really excited about and hoping to look into is trying to track ridership via smartphone apps. And use different types of nudges and incentives to get people to actually use e-bikes that they have. There's a classic question of, yes, you can get people to install new technologies, whether that's home appliances or other things like e-bikes. But what really matters is how much behavioral change you can get. How do you get people to actually use them? And that's all I have. I'm looking forward to the panel discussion.
Great. Thanks so much both for those great presentations. Really valuable to hear from both the policymaker side as well as the researcher side on how these partnerships can come together. And just a quick reminder to participants, feel free to add questions at any time to the Q&A box, and we'll answer those in a few minutes. So moving to our panel discussion, first, I'd love to hear from Krute about what are some recommendations you have for state and local jurisdictions who are interested in learning more and moving into a successful research partnership.
Yeah, I think, from what I learned from this pilot, it was helpful to start with some key questions. That was developed. What we did, we developed them internally. I collaborated with colleagues from different program areas. But then, the consultant team then designed a pilot to answer these questions and to attain our goals. And, we needed to know who the nudgeable audience was, what would compel them to change their behavior. And to do this, we needed data on demographics, geography, bike ownership, experience with trying different travel modes. So, we kind of put this out there, and because we don't have the capacity or even the expertise in-house, Metropia and their team kind of brought this in. And the team, was composed of data scientists, market researchers, and evaluators to kind of figure out how to target people. and then continually iterate on the messaging and incentive levels throughout the pilot. So I think, just to summarize, I think it's helpful to have a defined set of objectives and goals and questions going into your program or your pilot, especially for these types of behavior change programs where you don't quite know what's going to compel people to change their behavior.
Great. Casey, do you have anything to add in terms of what you've seen as good recommendations?
Yeah, so I would say, and I think this is kind of reflected in my remarks about the partnership with ARC. I think, you know, if government partners really want to build in an evaluation, I think getting in touch with researchers early on in the process is super helpful, because researchers, academics can help brainstorm, can help, you know, I think we're often really interested in like figuring out what your goal is and then using our understanding of behavioral economics or just neoclassical economic incentives as to what might be effective in shifting behavior. And I think we're also really good at kind of identifying clever ways to implement evaluations. And so that's what I see our kind of comparative advantages. And the way that partners should view academics is kind of like free research. I can't tell you how much of my time is helping PhD students find an interesting policy relevant dissertation question. And what these governmental partners are doing is, you know, they're generating data and implementing policies that I think, you know, we want to be able to contribute to.
Great. And then this kind of ties in. What excites you most about the Climate Action Learning Lab opportunity, and what are the areas of the call that you think jurisdictions could most benefit from?
Yeah, so I would say, you know, one thing, you know, I mentioned in my talk was that there was a lot of demand for partnering with ARC once we learned about the program. But that was really too late to have any input into the design of the program or to kind of really build in an evaluation. And I think we got lucky just based on the design of the program that they decided to roll out. But I think the big thing is really this connection between practitioners and researchers who, I think, you know, if there's a way to find mutually beneficial interests, where academics, you know, we're primarily motivated by publications and we're always thinking about, you know, can I sell this idea to a journal editor? Can we learn something new about economics or behavioral economics? But we really want to see like these insights be put into practice as well. And so the thing I'm most excited about is creating a community where these conversations can happen and mutually interesting ideas come out of that, where the analysis is the point of trying to push something forward and make programs more effective.
Great. How about you, Krute?
Yeah, I agree with everything that Casey just said. I think from my perspective, you know, when I put the RFP out there, I wasn't expecting randomized control trials. I've heard of control group treatment groups. I just didn't realize that they could be relevant to this pilot program. So for me, like this pilot was my own learning lab because I learned, you know, what the RCTs or randomized control testing could do, what the benefits are, and it's making me think about, you know, not just kind of behavior change programs, but kind of all the outreach that we do as a public agency, you know, from, you know, as I mentioned, we have this regional transportation plan. How can we get better and more effective outreach and comments back from the public and diverse members of the public by doing more kind of targeted or personalized outreach to them. So I think it can the approach can be much more broader than kind of the application that we used for this pilot program. So I think that was, you know, and just having this understanding or just learning about different research techniques and having a key question and answering it, I think was just all very interesting to me. And I think, participants in your learning lab will have the opportunity to kind of learn that in a more structured and I think universal way.
Great. So before we turn back to the call application process, one question came up from an attendee around how the RCT methodology differs from marketing A/B testing. Casey, wondering if you can shed some light on the key differences there.
Yeah, I think so. There's a lot of similarities. I think the purpose of the two are slightly different. I think RCTs, the goal is really to measure the causal effect of some intervention, and marketing A/B testing is, I think, giving customers two different options and seeing which one is more effective at selling more, or like keeping attention on a website or selling more goods or something like that. So I think there's a lot of similarities in the sense that they're both randomized to learn something about consumers or behavior. But I think the RCT approach is a little bit more intentional at testing different hypotheses, specifically with respect to kind of learning something about how different behavioral interventions or incentives will affect behavior. But there are kind of a lot of similarities in the way that they are implemented.
Great, that's helpful. Well, thank you both so much for sharing these thoughts. We really value your insights on the whole research process from your different perspectives. I'm going to turn it back over to Erin for a brief recap on next steps for the Climate Action Learning Lab.
Great. Thanks, Maggie. So I can be brief. I want to make sure that there's a couple minutes left for any other questions from the audience. I just wanted to recap some of the resources that are available and some of the key next steps for the Climate Action Learning Lab. So the big takeaway here is that our application deadline is March 31st. But in advance of that, I think we want to provide a lot of opportunities for those who are interested to learn more. So if you use the QR code here on the screen, it'll bring you to a list of resources that include a link to the Learning Lab webpage and the application form. There's also a place to sign up for office hours with JPAL staff, so really with Maggie, myself, and a couple of our colleagues to discuss this opportunity in more detail. I think this is truly a learning lab in that we want to learn a lot from all of you on what your priorities are, what kind of supports are most useful. I think we are really flexible in how this programming gets rolled out. We really want to be responsive to the needs of those who are interested in connecting. And in addition, I think there's a couple other resources, including the Transportation Decarbonization White Paper. And we've also included a list of other conducted and ongoing studies that have been conducted by researchers in the JPAL network in the transportation and climate mitigation space to give you a sense of what other types of studies have been conducted and what the findings of that research has been. And then for those who are interested, especially if your programming spans across multiple sectors beyond transportation, we will be holding a second webinar next Thursday, which is March 6th at 1 p.m. Eastern on advancing residential energy efficiency through rigorous evaluation. And a link to register for that event is also on the link tree. And we'll also be sharing the link tree in follow-up email to all webinar registrants, along with the link to the webinar recording and the slide deck. And I can hand it back to you, Maggie.
Great, thanks. So again, feel free to add any additional questions in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. Erin, I'm wondering if you can shed some light for teams thinking about structuring their application. If there are multiple teams working on different aspects of climate programming, just how should they structure a call application?
Sure. Yeah, happy to share a couple of thoughts about this. We've received some questions from jurisdictions that have multiple teams that might be interested in participating in the lab. And my sense is that we're looking to have an application submitted from a group of practitioners who are focused on a particular program or a suite of programs, and we're encouraging the application to be submitted on behalf of 2 to 5 members per team. I think if there is a transportation department that's kind of operating somewhat separately from a building decarbonization office, we would be very open to having multiple submissions from the same jurisdiction. And we're also just happy to troubleshoot or talk through ideas in office hours. I think there's also a link to just the general email too. If you have a quick question and just want to shoot something off quickly to us, we'll try to respond as quickly as possible.